Ladies and gentlemen, I guess we will begin. My name is Brent Askvig. I am the Executive Director of the North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities here in Minot, North Dakota in the United States. I want to welcome you to webinar number 2 on the Inclusive Supported Employment Initiative. This webinar series is hosted by NAKU, the National Competence Center on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in Norway, and our center, North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities here in North Dakota. The co-directors of this series are Dr. Karl Ellingsen, who you'll hear from a little bit later, from NAKU, and myself. We're so excited that during these difficult times that we're able to bring together so many people to talk about something that is very important in our work lives and perhaps even in our personal lives. Today's webinar is about law, policy, and regulation and its impact on inclusive supported employment around the world. Our series of webinars, again, this is number 2, has been focusing on some of the basic tenets of inclusive supported employment and how service providers, professional organizations, advocates and advocacy organizations, and country and local governments are implementing supported employment. We're going to hear from several international colleagues today who work tirelessly to advocate and educate policymakers, service providers, and people with disabilities about supported employment. These colleagues have tremendous experience in working on policy, law, regulations that deal with supported employment and other related aspects of their jobs. And we're so thankful that they're here with us. Today, we will have up to 45 different sites who have registered for this and approximately 150 people attending. That is absolutely amazing. The countries represented on our registration lists are Canada, US, Norway, Italy, Lithuania, Sweden, Romania, Germany, Greece, England, Scotland, and Australia. I hope I've not missed any. I just was looking at our list and I hope that's. So this is a very important aspect of a lot of people's lives all around the world, and we're glad that you could join us today. We're also glad that you're able to join us during these difficult times around the world with COVID-19. This is something that we know has impacted so many lives and so many of the services that people are able to get or unfortunately not be able to get. And we want to thank you for taking your time out during your busy lives and dealing with everything that you have to deal with and being able to meet this way. We had actually planned to do this webinar virtually from the very beginning. Little did we know that Zoom and Skype and FaceTime and Teams and Meet Me and Meet Now and all of these digital things would actually be part of what we do every single day. What's interesting is that I had prepared some information about that I would share with folks about how to handle Zoom and how to work with Zoom as we go through this conference. My guess is that every one of us now are experts at this, and anybody that has been doing this a lot, we again applaud you because we know that this is sometimes just a difficult format for us to be in. I rather would be personally face to face with my 100 employees than having to do this. So we will be recording this webinar today, and this webinar will then be available through the NAKU website, naku.no, and you'll hear more about that later on. That'll be available to the public at no charge. So we know that time zones and meeting schedules and work schedules and things don't always make it the perfect venue for being live to be able to participate. So it will be available for others later on. We would just ask that you would stay muted during this presentation. you'll be able to see and hear the presenters. They may or may not be able to see you, but if you have questions, we would ask that you use the chat feature. And if you would use the chat feature to chat to everyone, that will allow us to get your questions as we go through the process, to be able to find out who that is, where that question is coming from, and then which presenter that question can go to. We will be asking our presenters in a moment to, as we go through them, to ask them what it is that they want to do. Do they want to do the questions at the end of their presentation? If they want to do questions at the very end of the entire meeting, we'll have time to be able to do either of that. If you have any questions during the Zoom webinar, please just put a chat there. If there are any issues that are coming up with your receipt of this presentation, again, if you're able to do the chat, let us know. If not, in our meeting notice, we gave our emails there. I just want to spend just a couple of moments to talk to you about what it is that Dr. Ellingsen and I discussed about what is inclusive supported employment. That adds a different word, the word inclusive. It adds a different word to what we normally use and when we talk about supported employment. So in planning this, the colleagues from NAKU and our center talked extensively about our experiences in supported employment and how the concepts in customized employment and supported employment had developed throughout the years, and the differences that people across nations have had in understanding, using, and improving the employment services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Dr. Ellingsen and I had the opportunity about 1 year ago to attend the European Union on Supported Employment Conference in Amsterdam. And that's where we met two of our speakers that we have today. We realized that at that conference and during our discussions that the experiences that we have had and perhaps that others in our own countries have had are not the same experiences perhaps that people have had at different countries around the world. They're not all the same. In some locations, the programs and the legislation and the funding for supported employment was very solid. It was in good standing. However, in some locations, there were some barriers to full implementation of supported employment or customized employment or inclusive supported employment. So for the purpose of this webinar, we decided that a shared international understanding of the many ways that nations and programs can serve individuals with disabilities to achieve inclusive community employment was important. The name inclusive supported employment, I think resonates with some of our fundamental values and concepts of employment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We do want full employment, community employment, and employment with people without disabilities. We do want to recognize the full capabilities and abilities and skills amongst all the different workers and how they contribute to the business, how they contribute to the individual worker, and how they contribute to the community. Now, we recognize that lots of people in the literature, and perhaps many of you who are here today, have contributed to that, and that knowledge base about supported employment or customized employment or inclusive supported employment and those strategies have been discussed for many years. In fact, for the past 18 years, we know that researchers have spoken about the basic concepts of supported employment. In some cases have even compared supported employment to customized employment. But we know that those aren't terms that everybody uses, that those terms are perhaps different across the world, and we want to acknowledge that. While we may not have certain programmatic or legislative or regulation or support in some cases for some of these strategies, we know they're still important, and we're all working to do our best to make sure that those values of work for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is of utmost importance. So with that in mind, we have a lot to learn. And so I'm so excited about this webinar series, and I'm excited about the webinar today. Our agenda today is to begin with Mr. Rick Kane, and I will introduce him in one moment. We will have Mr. Kane do his presentation. We will then have Mr. Davies do his presentation. And then at about 10 minutes past the hour, we will have Mrs. Suzie Rutkowski from Cincinnati joining us. She is in a meeting until that time, so she will be joining us. We will have time for discussion. We will have time for questions, and we can begin. Our first speaker today is Mr. Rick Kane. Rick is the CEO for Disability Employment Australia, the professional organization representing, supporting, and resourcing the disability employment sector throughout Australia. He's worked in disability employment since 1996, beginning his career at the Salvation Army, moving on to be the executive officer at Workforce, and then working at Wise Employment for 10 years as the policy advisor. Mr. Kane has seen multiple changes to the structure of disability employment, including the introduction of case-based funding, the adoption of different assessment models, and program operations for performance and compliance frameworks. Through it all, person-centered assistance, ongoing support, and disability services standards have been integral to the best practice and outcomes. His current work focuses on government relations and policy development as it relates to best practice and continuous improvement for increasing employment outcomes for people with disabilities in Australia. This includes engaging international perspectives. He represents the sector's best practices in his work with government, disability advocates, employers, and academics. I had the pleasure of meeting Rick in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, at the European Union on Supported Employment, and from, I believe, Melbourne, I hope that's correct, Melbourne, Rick is joining us in the middle of the night. Thank you, sir. We really appreciate that. And Mr. Kane, the first.
Okay. Thanks, Brent. And there's no Mr. Kane, it's just Rick. And first of all, thank you, Brent and Karl, for inviting me to be part of this webinar, and to everybody that's on this webinar. I'm going to give you a perspective of the sort of what's happening in Australia. I'm going to draw a historical line to where we are now, and throw in a couple of fairly significant sort of policy interventions that are either very, very good or very, very questionable, and finish with the situation that literally has just opened up for the Australian disability employment services sector in the last month or so. So we'll see if I can do all that in about 15 minutes. The first thing to understand from the Australian perspective, and I apologise if there are people on this webinar that know a fair bit about the Australian situation, but the first thing to understand is that Australia has a nationally endorsed disability employment service. It was interesting, Brent was talking about the difference between inclusive supported employment and supported employment. To throw another semantic into the mix, in Australia we call the equivalent of supported employment open employment, and supported employment in Australia is references what the old language was sheltered workshops, and in Australia are now called Australian Disability Enterprises. And when in the first instance of me explaining this, when I talk about supported employment, we use a much broader reference that encompasses disabilities across the board, or cohorts of disability. But I will be arriving at the question of support for intellectual and developmental and the autism spectrum as well. because there's a critical question that's happening in Australia at the moment. So in the 1980s, through advocates, families, and people with disability who basically had reached that point of we want something more than the special school, sheltered workshop, day program, and then inevitably death. We want something more than that. We want something aspirational. And the right government, the right minister, the right advocacy, a whole lot of things that go to that perfect storm created the Disability Services Act 1986. And that legislation encompassed a range of services, including accommodation, including rehabilitation, but most importantly for this conversation, included supported employment, or what at the time was known as competitive employment training and placement services. And that legislation is basically the driver of how the DES program, as we currently call it, has operated since then. It started small in trial sites in various cities across Australia, and over time into the early 90s, developed into a program overseen by a federal government department. Quick reference point, just in case people are wondering about the Australian political situation. We have a federal government, we have state governments, and we have local governments that represent your local sort of suburbs and regions. Programs like Disability Employment Services are operated at a national level. Those programs do not then get handed down to a state level. They get administered and overseen and regulated at the federal level. So the Department of Social Services is the department responsible. The program chuffed along for quite a number of years into the 2000s. And in the early 2000s, a decision was made, and it's quite a significant issue, to move DES, as it was operating then, into the labour market department. So it moved from the Social Services Department, which was a much stronger policy-driven department, with no disrespect to the Labour Market Department, but it moved into that, which was much more a process-driven department. It operated the Generalised Employment Service, and then it took control of the Disability Employment Service. This is critical because the program itself and the providers operating it and the history of it did come essentially from working with intellectual disability. Young people coming out, transitioning from school was basically the core sort of population that services targeted. Once it moved into the much bigger labour market department, the labour market sort of structures took over. We joke, but not in a funny way, that it did two things for the Disability Employment Service sector. It definitely developed the governance model for providers to operate. And as I'm sure would be the case in many countries around the world, disability services coming from a community sector had trouble moving into a stronger governance model to basically protect their strategic understanding of how to operate and obviously their financial structures in how to operate. The DES program was gifted that in a very hard way by being in the labour market department in the federal government. The flip side of it was that a lot of the sensibility of direct servicing, of person-centeredness, and other aspects that you would be all too familiar with were kind of like a stone. The water rubbed that off the program. And during the 10 years that we were in that program, we did see a decline in the numbers of people with intellectual disability accessing the program. So it moves forward, and in around 2015, a decision is made to move it back into the Social Services Department. This is a critical moment, And it actually is represented by Australia's journey from being part of the UN Convention on the Rights for People with a Disability, but only signing on as a signatory in 2008 when there was a change of government at the time. And out of that, that sort of moment of becoming a signatory to the convention, enacted a couple of important things, notably the National Disability Strategy, which set forth a way that Australia would re-examine how disability services beyond disability employment services operated. In that examination, the critical thing that came out of that was the Productivity Commission that looked at how disability services operated and basically handed down a scathing report in about 2011 that led to, through a whole series of things that I am squashing together in a sentence, that led to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is the revolutionary model in Australia for people with a disability to access services that are basically part of an assessment and determination of their need. This has not been without its faults, and if you're an interested stakeholder wherever you are in the world, you've probably read things and talked to people about different things. We don't resile from the fact that it's had a very, very bumpy ride, but the idea inherent in it is greater choice and control for the individual, including the money going to the individual rather than to the service. And this is leading to a lot of other societal changes, notably the sort of understanding of disability more generally in the community. I am really crossing in headline terms over a lot of different factors, but it also impacts on the DES program. The DES program moves back into the department responsible for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, undergoes a review that changes some critical features of the program, notably giving more choice and control to the participant, notably making it a market model that has a contestability built into it that encourages providers to go deeper into the community, where the estimate is somewhere between 250 and maybe over 500,000 people who aren't accessing a workforce participation service might do so. To put it in perspective, the national program basically at the end of the contract in 2017 had around 190,000 people in the program across Australia. 18 months later, it had over 80,000 more people had entered the program. Or to put it in more granular perspective, the 4 years prior to that, only 40,000 new people had come into the program. And with the change of emphasis, deeper into the community, more choice and control for the individual, and opening it up as a market model so that providers started to see the community and the employer more as their customer rather than basically servant to master relationship with the department, we identify as being the core reason for the significant increase in the program. That all sounds rosy, right? It isn't. 80,000 more people into a program is obviously a fairly steep increase in cost to program. And the political winds that blow through any sort of country at any time, before we even get into two significant impacts that have occurred in Australia, notably the bushfire season that you may have seen on your news through around November through to February. It was devastating. It devastated lots of communities and so on. And it basically impacted on around 25% of the population of Australia, and extrapolate that into the sort of community services and so on. Just as we were coming up for air from that, obviously with the rest of the world, COVID has done what it's done, and that's had an even more significant impact. So we have a government that's had to expend a lot of money to basically keep things afloat, and may now be looking at how to claw back even every single dollar. And they have determined to do a review of the DES program, even though the new DES program has only been operating for 2 years. They've determined to do that, we identified, because they see the cost blowout because of the 80,000. So we are now at the moment in a sort of fairly intense review / argument that is trying to demonstrate the difference between cost and value. 80,000 more people participating, many thousands of them, who may never have entertained the idea of employment being an option, or who may have entertained the option but had been burnt maybe 5 years ago and is distrusting, is giving it another shot. And where our argument is, stay the course, government, hold your line, because COVID is going to do what it's going to do, and we're all going to have to deal with it. But as we come out the other end, whether that's in 3 months, 6 months, or 18 months' time, we want to ensure that we don't fall back in terms of community understanding and awareness of disability, particularly in the critical idea that employment is the bridge to social and economic inclusion. One last point, Brent, because I'm not sure if I've exhausted my time, but I did mention the NDIS, and the NDIS has been a critical factor over the last 5 to 7 years in its growth in Australia. One of its shortfalls, even though subject to what you've researched or read, you may think, well, there's many shortfalls. One of the critical shortfalls is basically the idea that the model as put forward through the Productivity Commission recommendations is an actuarial model that has a return on investment that is based on the percentage of people that do have participant plans, a percentage of those people using those plans to go into employment. Now, this is where the DES program as it operates is trying to find an intersection with the NDIS. And it's based on a couple of very ideas that hold attention. And that is that the DES program has, whatever I was talking about, 270 to 280,000 people on it at the moment. But about 80 or a bit over 80% of that number are people with either psychological disability or physical disability. And intellectual and learning disability and neurological and autism represent, combined with those two, about 12% of the caseload. At the same time, the NDIS has grown, with the numbers expected to reach something like over 400,000 people when it's fully implemented. And the working age population should see, these are the guesstimates that you can go on the NDIS website and other places and see these numbers. They're a bit rubbery, just as a wink, but that's the public data that we have. And there is an expectation that around 30 to 35% of people of working age population with NDIS participant plans will have employment supports in those plans. The issue, not the issue, but the question is that the bulk of the population in the NDIS is intellectual disability, and the rising cohort is autism. So on one hand, we have a DES program that's operating, has been operating for close to 30 years. A lot of the providers have been around for that long, a lot of structures in place and a lot of connections to local community and employers. But with a smaller, much smaller percentage working directly with intellectual, developmental and autism. At the same time as the NDIS needs people with a very good understanding of employment servicing to assist and support a growing cohort of people that are in the NDIS to help them move through employment supports into open employment. And everything that I've talked about, I have to stress, is about open employment. And I should have said right from the start that DEA, the company that we are, we actually reject the alternative. Or to put it another way, we say pay award wages and don't congregate, and you can call yourself what you like, right? So the NDIS is about moving people into open employment. The DES sector is there, but the DES sector has to build its capability in working directly with intellectual, autism and developmental to basically make that intersection work. So I think I got through a fair bit there, and I wasn't checking for questions, and I'm not sure if there was anything more that you wanted at the moment, Brent, from what I've been saying.
I would open it up for questions and ask folks if they have a question to please put that into the chat. While we wait for that for a moment, Rick, I wonder if you could address this question. Many times when new initiatives are developed, and it sounds like you've got a new initiative, a new system going now here in the last 2 years, that consistency of implementation of that new policy or that new law becomes a problem. How different people interpret it in different ways. And so how are you as your organization or different providers or even the government trying to deal with that issue of consistency of implementation? In other words, this is what the law really means, please follow this.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Brent, and it is literally what we are trying to put a position paper together in response to the review that I mentioned. What we've identified, it was probably there in front of us, but we were, up until the review, we were looking at this problem over here and this problem over here. Some of our members thought that the market model meant that there was a saturation of providers in some areas, that meant that there wasn't enough business, and that the competition itself was doing more harm to the community and sort of collaborative sense of how they operated. What we think we've identified that we will be putting into our position paper is that the government inadvertently, I think, is having it both ways, that they've set a course, the market model, and set up a couple of sort of structures for that to happen, but are still operating the program as if it's the old style master-servant relationship. So it's heavy on administration, heavy on compliance, when a market should be a more regulatory sort of relationship that gives the concept that was presented to providers as we went into this model, that with choice and control, participants could choose with their feet, right? And there's allowances that, there's flexibilities to allow that to happen. But the administrative requirements that sit behind that are a bit of a nightmare for providers. I should also note, because I think we might be one of the only countries in the world that has this, and don't ever wish it on your own country, and that is we have a centralised computer system for employment services, that all information gets recorded through the centralised system. And over the years, another policy problem that occurs, again inadvertently, is that the bureaucrats fall in love with the computerised system and start responding to what the computerised system can learn. So they develop policies that work to the computerised system rather than to the needs of the individual. An example of that, for example, is something that would occur anywhere in the world would be a job plan negotiated between the participant, the provider, and family, and you know, a circle of support if that was there. The job plan in the Australian model is situated in the centralised system with drop-down boxes for a tailored and individualised service. And we tried to argue leading into this model, to go back to your question, Brent, we tried to argue that you didn't need the job plan in there. You just needed a box. Has a job plan been completed? Tick. They have regular sort of desktop monitoring, so they can always request 10 or 12 files and check that the job plan's in there. And we thought that would be an allowance for a more individualised approach to occur. So that's one example. But critically, we think where the disjunct is that a model was set up for people to respond to, but the government or the department is still operating as if we're in the old model.
Thank you. I think, Karl, we have a few other questions here.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say hi to Rick and thank you for the presentation. And also, I think that what you are talking about now lately about adjusting to the system is also very well known to be a good reason why some people are excluded, not included. So I think there is something very important in what you're saying. But regarding the questions, there are 3 questions as far as I can tell from the chat. And I think maybe, Rick, that you can see them yourself. And perhaps the best way is if you just look at them and then answer them in order.
Okay, this is from Kathy. Okay, that was just a comment. Thanks, Kathy. And Hugh, how is Australia supporting a transition from segregated employment to open employment? Good question, Hugh. So the segregated model, which is called Australian Disability Enterprises, basically in the last 2 years, it's transitioned inside the NDIS, and therefore funding has moved from the provider to the individual. Another factor in regard to recent times in Australia, and we're going back, I think, about 6 years, a court case put forward by 2 young men with intellectual disability questioning what they were being paid, went through the Australian court system and went, I think it went up to the High Court, but it might have just got up to the Federal Court in terms of the levels of legal systems in Australia. And they won it, which was brilliant, right? But the government then brought in these sort of big guns, and there's been a tussle, a legal tussle over the sort of the way that a new model could be created to basically respond to the sort of what was handed down from the court case, but then diluted so that providers could continue to pay less than what would be your sort of base pay if you're in open employment. I'm being a bit vague about that one because A, I'm not really across it, and B, it's been so complicated, and I'm trying very careful not to put my foot in what might just be straight out opinion. But the win was great, but the win hasn't translated to a more materially understood way of paying somebody in that sort of model. Having said that, no, might be sounding contrary to a couple of different things, but having said that, the intention that the Department of Social Services and the NDIA had in moving the ADE model into the NDIS was the sort of erosion of that segregated model, that support. So to use that expression, which gets confusing in Australia and out of Australia, regarding supported employment, the sort of policy intent was that over time, quite a number of the existing ADEs who were largely operating on sort of the funding that they were receiving rather than the business that they were operating, might have to close down. And the DES model and the employment support model inside the NDIS, which I've already mentioned, hasn't really developed in timing with the amount of people coming into the scheme, was hoping that people would move away from, and really focusing on young people in this point, move away from seeing a sort of sheltered workshop ADE as the sort of first choice of employment, and might test other ways of getting employment. So if that all sounded like a scrambled egg, it's pretty much what it is. Brent, how have you put values, best practice statements into policy or law? I did come prepared. When the new DES program started, or going into it, when people were putting in their grant applications, there is a document which is the guidelines to the new DES. It's on a website, Community Grants Hub, that can be accessed. And in that document, they have a description of the program, about the grant program. And I'm just going to read the very last paragraph from that section. It's page 6 or 7 from that document. So just reinforcing the question, how have you put values, best practice statements into policy or law? So this is what somebody who was thinking about applying to get a license to operate in the new DES, this is what they read to identify what they might do. The expected outcomes of DES are to ensure people with disability have a greater opportunity to actively participate in Australian society. Disability employment services offer the platform to ensure that everyone who is able to participate in the labour market has the best opportunity and support to develop their skills and confidence to find and keep a job. I think anyone hearing that would say, wow, that's pretty impressive, right? Well, we're having a review of the DES program right now, and they're talking about the efficacy of the program as it relates to policy goals. And no one has quoted that. When they're talking about the efficacy of the program, and I don't want to sound cynical about this, I don't mean to sound cynical, but when they talk about the efficacy, they're talking about the employment outcomes. Now, employment is the base, it's the jewel of the program. But the program, the Disability Employment Service Program in Australia, has always been about employment opportunities through support of developing skills and confidence. And that takes different times for different people and different supports and different sort of mechanisms. And we're concerned that the review is not recognising that. So there's a lot of good ideas, but when it comes to the crunch, we get drawn into, unfortunately, those two sort of devils, efficiency and effectiveness. and a lot of the support, and again, I'm not telling people on this webinar anything that they don't know from their own experience, that efficacy of a program is about engaging the participant, right? We've made the point that 80,000 more people coming in is as good an example of the efficacy of the program, but the department is calling it an overspend. And I think the last one, what is the relationship between community organisations and DES providers? That's from Kathy. That's a good question as well. In terms of the DES program in Australia, there's 110 providers have contracts to operate. They range from 2 or 3 very large and for-profit organisations, and right all the way down to small standalone providers. The community organisation relationship, there's not a clear way to answer that, because there's quite a number of DES providers that are actually what I would interpret from the question as being community organisations. And those community organisations range from being, as I just mentioned, small standalone ones to ones that have grown over time. So one organisation, the parent company is GenU, but the employment service is Matchworks. They're a huge disability service based in a place called Geelong, which is a city about 60 or 70 kilometres from Melbourne itself. They've worked with intellectual disability for 50 years. So but they've grown, and they're a significant service, but they're still very much a community organisation. If I take it a bit further and extrapolate the question to mean community organisations external to what might be an employment service, again, there's probably 100 different ways that organisations work, but the best way that you can work, that has been proven over and over again, which wouldn't be very different from any of the experiences that would be cited by anyone else in this conversation, that the more engaged you are with the raft of community services that are in your sort of town or suburb or region, the better you are at developing up the sort of support needs that go into building the capacity and skills for the participant. So there's not a specific way that it occurs, but in terms of the members of our peak body and the conversations we have with them, they're all the usual sort of things, you know, the mental health services, the sort of the libraries, the sort of food and accommodation services, and some of them work indirectly, some work directly, and so on. I'm not sure if that helped much, Kathy, but that's the response. Okay, so I think that's it, Brent. Scroll down. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, yep.
Thank you for all the questions, everyone. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mr. Hugh Davies. Hugh is the Chief Executive of the BASE, or British Association for Supported Employment, holding that position since 2008. He previously chaired the association from its formation in 2006 and actually chaired one of its predecessors, AFSI, from 2002 through 2006. He is one of the vice presidents of the European Union of Supported Employment. Mr. Davies was previously the Regional Employment Team Coordinator for Northwest Care Services Improvement Partnership, or CSIP. This strategic role supported the regional implementation of government policy on mental health and employment. From 1993 to 2007, Mr. Davies was a manager of Brewery EST, a local authority that supported employment, a local authority supported employment agency that provided employment support for disabled job seekers, care leavers, recovering drug misusers, minority ethnic communities, and job retentions projects. I had the privilege of interacting with Mr. Davies at EUSE last year and listening to his presentations. And from the UK, welcome, Hugh.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it okay to share? I've got a PowerPoint. I thought it might be easier for people whose first language might not be English.
Absolutely.
Okay. Right. Does that come up all right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, the brief is around law, policy and regulation. And I'll try and cover those one at a time. Everything's got a bit complicated, not just by COVID, but by Brexit. So it's uncertain days for us. Just a bit of background on BASE. We're a national membership charity. Our purpose is to inform our members, encourage and exchange best practice, and to lobby for better funding and policy to enable our members to deliver high quality supported employment. I'm dreading a change in the name to customize or individualize supported employment. We'll have to change everything in our titles. So I'm going to stick with supported employment along with the rest of Europe for now. Our members mainly support people with developmental disabilities, autism, and mental health needs, particularly the more severe long-term mental health needs. We've got 200 organizations as members, and they're a really varied bunch from big national commercial providers through to very small social enterprises. Quite a few local public authorities in there as well. So we don't try to necessarily represent our providers. We're more about representing supported employment and promoting that. And then we've also got a trading company that runs alongside and delivers training and events and so on. Supported employment's been around in the UK since probably the late 1970s. On a small scale. It expanded rapidly in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We don't need legislation to establish a service. I know a lot of Europe, I'm not sure about America, but a lot of Europe requires legislation before they can put services in place. We don't need any of that. We're very deregulated, which is a good thing sometimes and a terrible thing other times. Most of the specialist employment support is locally funded in the UK. The government tends to concern itself with national, large, mainstream welfare to work programs. It says that some of these are for people with disabilities and health conditions, but it's pretty difficult if you've got autism or anything other than a mild learning disability to get onto some of these programs. We used to have a national program called WorkStep until 2010. It was delivered, that and another program that ran alongside it were delivered by about 400 different providers in the country. In 2010, the government decided it would make life easier for itself and just have 28 contract areas covering the country. So the number of providers suddenly shrank from about 400 to about 10 that could be funded through the government department. Many of the services previous to this had been funded, had been delivered by local authorities, municipalities, and some of those took that as a signal to get out of delivering services. It's not a statutory service, so the provision across the country is very patchy. Some services, some areas you might have 2 or 3 providers in your area. Other localities, there's nothing. So it's a very patchy picture at the moment because it's so dependent on local funding. This is where it's got us in terms of employment rates over the last 7 or 8 years. These are the latest figures I've got. So the number of people who are known to health and social care who have an intellectual disability, 6% are in employment. For people with more long-term mental health needs, the figure is 8%. These figures include people who might be working as little as 1 hour a week. All local areas have to report data on employment rates, so they collect it annually, submit it to government, and we have national indicators that get published each year. The figure's pretty static. It's gone down, if anything, over the years. Seems to be a bit of a pickup around mental health recently, but overall the trend is not good. What we do know is that probably across the whole of England, there are less than 2,500 people with an intellectual disability who are working more than 16 hours a week. 16 hours a week is a bit of a threshold, because once you start working that many hours, you have to come off welfare benefits. Working less than 16 hours a week, you keep your entitlement to welfare benefits. So there's a lot of pressure from families and other people that if someone's going to get a job, they stay working just a few hours a week. Our job is to encourage people to maximize their working hours. There are huge changes in the welfare benefits system in the UK. It's quite a punitive system. It doesn't encourage people to have a go, to try out work. So we're looking for more flexibilities. We're looking for a bit more of a safety net to let people try out more full-time hours, knowing that if it all goes wrong, they don't lose out on their welfare benefits. Policy-wise, I guess a bit similar to Australia. The term supported employment has been used previously by government to describe factory-based services. So we've had to reclaim the title back from them. I think we've got there now with that. Since that big change to programs in 2010, the government procurement systems have gone for fewer contracts with larger commercial companies. So this has encouraged overbidding, under delivery, cherry picking of people who come onto the service so that they work with the more able, the quicker to find a job for. And clients who they find difficult to support, they tend to park up. This has been a continual problem since 2010 with the government's commissioning strategy. There are signs recently that they're looking at the impact of all of this and that they're going to change how they procure services in the future, and that will be very welcome. I suppose like other countries, we've seen a lot of consolidation of providers as well. So you get a lot of big companies merging, so there are ever fewer providers really. But it does make it very difficult for smaller local organisations to get involved. Life as a subcontractor on the big programs is very difficult. Most supported employment has been funded through local authority areas. For the last 10 years or so, we've had quite a bit of austerity. There's no money for anything until suddenly COVID comes along. So many local areas have stopped funding supported employment altogether. It makes it very difficult for families living in those areas. On top of that, we've had quite a bit of devolution of powers over the last 10 years. So Scotland and Wales are increasingly getting their own policy around employment. They've already got it around education and health. And we've also seen some of the city areas getting more devolved powers. So Manchester now is able to use its own budgets and draw down government funding, but make its own decisions about how it procures services. I guess one of the issues to us is that with government only funding big mainstream provision and local specialist provision feeling the pinch, getting squeezed, that the United Nations Convention for the Protection of Rights of People with Disabilities, that Article 27 has become a very important driver for us in knocking on government's door and saying, how are you meeting the article? And we've had some success with that. I think it's made people a little bit twitchy and conscious that they need to publicly show how they can provide adequate support for all job seekers. Alongside this, we've got there's been huge changes in education policy. So we now have a much higher statutory focus on supporting young people with disabilities from education into work, mainly through the use of supported internships, but not only that. So increasingly we're seeing schools delivering employment support for the older age group within the schools, and colleges as well. There's much more of a focus on engaging with employers, getting people into workplaces. I'll come back to the supported internships. We've worked with our Department for Employment for a few years now around what would appropriate provision look like for somebody with a learning disability or for somebody with autism. We knew that the new program that came in a couple of years ago would not support people with learning disabilities. The government department was quite open about that. So we've worked with them to develop a trial where they reward job outcomes from locally commissioned provision. We don't want government procuring a big national supported employment program. I've nothing in principle against that if the provider's really good, but it's quite a risk and it puts everyone else out of business. So this was a bit of a first really, because our National Employment Department is not very keen on dishing out money to local areas without controlling how that money is spent and what services are procured. And we wanted to keep that decision making in local areas. So effectively the local authorities, the public authorities, have become prime contractors with government, and they decide who delivers the service in their area. So they can deliver it in-house, they can contract it with a voluntary organisation, or they can use 2 or 3 providers in their area if they want to. So the trial went on for 18 months, finished last year. It covered 9 public authority areas using 12 service providers. The customer groups all had to be known to local health and social care services. That meant that there wasn't a crossover with the more mainstream provision. And it included people with intellectual disabilities, people who are using long-term mental health services, and people with autism. There's a 50-50 split on funding with the local authorities, but the government money was only delivered for those people that got job outcomes of over 16 hours a week. It was a pretty successful program. Over half the people that came onto it got a job, but most of these jobs were under 16 hours a week and so didn't attract the government funding. The evaluation of it wasn't public, hasn't been published. It did say that the trial is too small to draw any firm conclusions, but it did conclude that the payment model didn't work. I don't know what things are like across your countries, but we've had a massive push towards payment by results. So generally the government will only fund about 20% service fee, and 80% of the funding is payment by results. Maybe staged, but it's still payment by results. And that just hasn't worked with this model. So we've continued talking to them about designer programs, and the next steps, it was due to go ahead this spring. It's been delayed by COVID and put back to the autumn, but the next step will be a larger 18-month trial, working with 20+ public authorities and using a different funding model. And the good news is they're dropping the payment by results. So the whole thing will be about funding by participation rather than results, which makes it much less risky for the public authorities to get involved in it. A key concern for us was making sure that the money went to proper supported employment provision rather than work preparation activities or job clubs. And so we got agreement that a model fidelity scale was going to be used with all of the providers involved in the program, and BASE audited each of those providers' self-assessments. I'll come back to that assessment later. Interestingly, what came out was that the providers with the best results, there was a correlation with their scores on the fidelity scale. So those that scored best on the fidelity scale tended to do best for results. In terms of support for young people, we've been working closely with our education department and government to improve job outcomes. There's been major reform over the last few years. Excuse me, dog in the house. Colleges are now funded, rather than delivering qualifications for people, they're funded to deliver life outcomes. I'm just going to close the door. Sorry about that. Employment is one of those outcomes. So for the first time, education is, the Department for Education is effectively funding colleges to get jobs for young people with disabilities, which is an interesting turnaround. This has been a big change, culture change for colleges. And they've got significant workforce development needs. So it's a time of great transition for those services. This provision, supported internships, can only be accessed by young people who have an education, health and care plan. So having that plan acts as a gateway to specialist provision for young people. It's meant to be a holistic transition plan. Starts at the age of 14, goes up to the age of 25. It's patchy, it's difficult to get that plan in some areas, but really important to get it because some of the provision is only open to those people. We've got limited data on outcomes and sustainability of supported internships. We think that job outcomes are about 28%. It's not good enough. What we're seeing is a lot of colleges getting into delivering employment support for the very first time. They're not very aspirational often. Often they've got very limited experience of employer engagement. And so there's a piece of work there to be done, I think, about getting better outcomes. And we're encouraging colleges to work in partnership with supported employment services because they already know the local area. They've got the links with business. And more importantly, when a person completes this program at the college, they're there to provide that ongoing support afterwards. Otherwise, people would just be left alone. There's also been some work around apprenticeships. They've been modified for young people who've got an education, health and care plan. So the requirements for the maths and English qualifications are much lower for the people with disabilities. That's a welcome move. It's early days yet. It's still bedding in. All the job coaching around internships and apprenticeships is funded using the Access to Work scheme. Access to Work is a national program and it pays for reasonable adjustments in the workplace. It's a good scheme. It's complex to administer, but it does mean that we can go to businesses and talk about the sort of support, the sort of equipment that they might need to make it easier to employ a person with a disability, knowing that the government funding is there to pay for that. Regulation. We've no inspection regime whatsoever in the UK. No ratings for services other than education-based provision. It makes it very difficult. If you're an employer, you've got two providers in your area. How do you know who's good and who's not good? Same for job seekers, particularly where you're looking at people having individual budgets and carrying the money themselves. Where do they know how do they know where to go to buy a service? We have some experience of using personal budgets, individualized budgets in the UK. I don't think it really worked. I'd prefer to see strategic commissioning. If you've got a personal budget what do you do if you're not getting good support? Can you go back and say, I want to start again with someone else with the full budget? Are you paying for a guarantee of a job, or are you just paying for somebody to try their hardest to get you a job? It's very unclear. And it doesn't really pay for the overheads around employer engagement and all the rest of it. So I prefer to see strategic commissioning. Given that we haven't got ratings or inspection, BASE was really keen to professionalize the sector. I think we've been seen by government for too long, and perhaps by business, as a bunch of do-gooders playing around with employment, almost like social workers dabbling with employment. So in 2012, with other partners, we developed national occupational standards for job coaching. These have been accepted across the UK and were reviewed and revised in 2017. And based on that, we developed a certificate for job coaches. Prior to this, there was nothing specific in place to train up job coaches. We had qualifications around learning and development, or around information, advice and guidance, careers advice, but nothing that encompassed the broad role of a job coach. So we brought the qualification in, got it accredited. We've had 500 people up to now enroll on it, and it looks like that's going to get a broader take-up, and we're hopeful that education is going to push this as well, so that job coaches within college settings have to work towards being qualified. And then in 2018, we worked with partner organisations across Europe to develop a quality framework as a tool for assessing model fidelity and the quality of services, and we're now issuing kite marks on that. Final slide really is just a bit about the quality framework. I think this is key for us in terms of promoting credible support to employers and to commissioners. Commissioners often have quite a broad brief. They're not experts in employment. They're not clear what they're commissioning, what good should look like. So we've got to guide them in that. We've got to show them what good should look like. And we've got to show employers what they should expect from us. So it's a self-assessment framework. It's based around the European Foundation for Quality Management. It looks at what goes into the system in terms of resources, management, strategy, your processes, and it looks at what comes out in terms of results for business, for society, for the environment, and so on, and has some key performance indicators built in. It's a huge document. It's too much for most people. So what we've done is produce an abbreviated version that just takes a couple of the sections of it. And we've, I suppose, described it as a model fidelity version. And it's been quite popular with government and with providers. It's very much geared around the 5 stages of supported employment. It builds in how organisations collect and analyse data, how they're using it, and there are some indicators built into it. The whole purpose of this is to encourage organisations to have quality assurance systems, because they are lacking at the moment. We're hoping that this is going to be adapted for use within supported internships in the UK as well, because our government department is quite keen for colleges to have a kite mark showing that they are good providers of supported internships. So we're just waiting for discussions to pick up on that. We've started issuing 3-year kite marks to providers who achieve certain scores. They've got to get 90% to get excellent provider status. And our hope is that this will be widely adopted, so it guides employers and job seekers around service quality. I think that's probably the biggest thing for us at the moment, is this professionalization of the sector, getting more credibility for the providers who are delivering it, and making it higher profile within recruitment processes for businesses. It's getting interesting at the moment, because the other thing is, how do you deliver employment support remotely? So there's a lot going on the side in terms of innovation and looking at how the business is going to change. potentially in the long term, hopefully just for the short term. And there's a bit of information there if people want to get, or contact me if you want more information on any of those aspects of the presentation. So thanks to Brent and to Karl for inviting me to present. I hope that's sort of what you were looking for.
Thank you so much, Hugh.
And apologies about the dog. The perils of Zoom.
It's good to have another dog lover online, so thank you. There is a question here on the side. I don't know if you can see that, Hugh, near the bottom.
More about access to work and what this does. It will pay for job coaches going into a workplace where the employer needs additional support to train somebody up in a job. If there's maybe a change in circumstances, what we find is that quite often somebody's job might be at risk because there's a change in line manager or a change in processes. What this means is the government will pay for a job coach to go in to support the employer. We would prefer the employer, where possible, to do the training, to do the support, because that's what good employers do. But if they need additional support, our job coaches can go in knowing that it'll be funded through access to work. It'll also pay for things like assistive technology, adaptations to the workplace if there need to be any. So, it'll pay for transport to work. If somebody, say, lives in a rural area and there's no public transport, they can get a taxi knowing that will be funded. If somebody has mental health needs and they have panic attacks because they're going to work on the school bus, you can get a taxi for them. It's paid for by the government. It's a really good program, potentially a world-leading program. It's growing quite fast. The budget is going up, but the bureaucracy is horrendous, and they keep changing the processes, and they don't tell anyone about it. And there are ways that it could be streamlined and work much simpler, I think.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you for the question, Kathy. Our next speaker, our final speaker today, is Ms. Suzie Rutkowski. She is the co-director and educational specialist for Project Search, which is located at the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States. She is a nationally recognized transition expert with specific experience in program development in career, technical education, and job development for young adults with disabilities. Previously, she served as manager for disability education at the Great Oaks career campuses for 12 years. During that tenure, she co-founded Project Search, which is an international network of sites that seek to secure competitive employment for people with disabilities. Suzie, welcome today, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. There you go.
Thanks, Brent. Really appreciate that and this opportunity. And it was so interesting listening to Hugh, because we have about 85 sites in the UK, and a lot of the things he was talking about were familiar. And we talked about scheme of work was complex. I think that like only scratches the surface. It seems like super complex and difficult at best. But I have got a PowerPoint too. I went much more high level than Hugh. My PowerPoint is really pretty basic, but it covers some things. And I wanted to say hi to Kathy. Kathy Melling said hello to me earlier, and it's nice to see your name there. I haven't seen you in a long time. It's great to see you, actually. Yes, I can see that. So will I be able to share my screen and the PowerPoint, Brent?
You should be able to. If not, I'm ready to upload it if you need to.
Did it come up or not?
Do you do share screen?
I click share?
Yep, on the
Got
bottom.
it? Got it. Okay.
There it is.
All right, there we go. So I'm going to talk a little. Brent asked me to, most of you probably know a little bit about Project Search. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about what it is. I'll do a little bit, but I'm really going to talk about laws perceptions and high expectations that we have. So just to get us started, one of the things that we are really proud of at Project Search is that in the last few years, we have developed a member portal. And yesterday I took a snipping tool of it so I can see exactly where we are, and that's the nice part. So anybody that's in one of our 600 sites has access to this, and at any point in time they can kind of see where we are with how many people we're serving. So you can see right now we have exactly 600 sites. That's actually been going down a little bit since COVID. Some programs are shutting down because of that. And we don't need to go into those reasons, but you can kind of guess. We're in 48 states and 10 countries, and right to date, we served almost 27,000 people, but that's only since 2010, because that's when we started keeping data. Our first program was actually in 1998, so we've served more people than that, but since 2010. We're also a model fidelity-based program. We started a model fidelity program, gosh, at least 10 years ago, when we realized that there were so many transition programs out there. We said to ourselves, what is unique about Project Search? What makes us different? And we've recently refined our 10 model fidelity components to 6. We wanted to be more succinct. And the first and most important is that the outcome is integrated competitive employment. And that's what we're all about. And I'll reference that throughout, but everything we do, every meeting that we have, every activity, every lesson plan, every internship needs to lead to integrated competitive employment. And we define that as 16 hours a week or more, competitive wage, non-seasonal integrated environment. Number 2 is that we want to serve young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And a lot of times people say, well, what do you mean by that? And we have to ask our partners, and especially some of our funding partners, would this young person benefit from an intensive year of career development and internship experience? And if you can answer yes, then we should be asking that person to apply. The program is a collaborative partnership. So every local Project Search program has an education partner, a host business, state vocational rehab in the US, a job coaching or job development supported employment agency, and long-term support agency as well. And our goal is to work together to fund and give resources and come to the outcome of employment together. The program is business focused, so every Project Search program happens in a host business. It used to be mostly hospitals. It's not really anymore. It could be any large quality business. We're in distribution centers and military bases and hospitality and hotels and resorts, so all kinds of other things than hospitals. The program leads to acquisition of competitive skills to help those young people get jobs, and the program is committed to continuous improvement. So those are the 6 things that we continually work on with all of our sites and ourselves as well. So this is what a day looks like for an intern. Typically it's about 8 to 2:30. They can vary on that a little bit, but typically you want those interns there 6.5 hours or 7 hours, with an hour and a half for curriculum and the rest of the time on their internships. And if you look at what a year looks like, most Project Search programs are somewhere in the area of 36 to 40 weeks, which includes several weeks at the beginning for orientation to the host site, and then 3 10-week internships with a week in between to kind of navigate to the next one. And most of them follow that academic year. So data. So Hugh talked about data. We look at data all the time. Right now we're finishing up our 18-19 year, and as you can imagine, that's being affected by COVID. So we're struggling to finalize that data. But if you look at the last couple columns or the last couple rows, so right now from our last year's data, if you look in the middle, so in the 17-18 year, that was our last year that we were, like I said, we're not finished collecting data right now on the 18-19 year. We had 77% that actually got a job, any job. but only 67% that met the project search criteria of 16 hours a week plus, integrated environment, etc. So while 67% is great, that means that 33% aren't achieving outcomes, and we're constantly figuring out what we can do to help us get better. Here's where we are in terms of hourly wage, and we are averaging about 25 hours a week. And as you can see, that's been consistent over the last few years. So Brent asked me to talk about laws, and the biggest law, at least in the US, and that's where the majority of our sites are. I would say 500 out of the 600 sites are in the US. So our biggest law, because most of our programs serve young adults still in school, about 10% of our programs serve adults out of school. And so the biggest law is IDEA, the Individuals Disabilities Education Act. And I know there's something similar in other countries, but again, in the US, this is what we work with that dictates what happens in the educational arena for students with a variety of different kinds of disabilities. And we focus in that transition area of 16 plus, so 16 years plus until they leave school. And what we really care about is that transition from school to work. So this is lifted straight from the law. Again, it's designed to be a results-oriented process. And when they say results, they mean training, post-secondary education, and integrated employment, which is where we come in. And that's why I highlighted that section. So IDEA, or the Individuals Disabilities Education Act, mandates that students with disabilities can be in school and can be served until 21. So hold that thought for a second, because then you'll see the complexity here in the US. So evidence-based practices say that students that are 16 years plus should be in a career tech program and should be in community work experiences before they get a job. So project search is that bridge between career exploration activities, community activities, and competitive integrated employment, because it gives them a year in a quality host business that allows them to experience work while they're also practicing social skills and job skills and how do I communicate with others and even relationships and all of that. In a fairly risk-free environment. I'm not saying they can't get kicked out of the program, because they can for certain things, for sure. So they're practicing all these things while immersed in a quality business for 6.5 to 7 hours every day for about 182 days out of the year. Here's the rub for us in the US. So there's a law that stemmed from the Education for Secondary Schools Act, which President Bush called No Child Left Behind, which has really hurt project search and lots of transition programs because it directs schools to graduate all students in 4 years of high school. Whereas IDEA says that students with disabilities can stay in school until 21, schools get their funding and their school ratings affected negatively if students stay longer than 4 years. So you can kind of see the rub there. IDEA says, oh, no worries, you have 6 or 7 years. No Child Left Behind comes in and says, wrong, schools, you got to get kids out in 4 years. Some schools say, I don't care, we'll take the hit, we'll take the funding hit, we don't care, we'll keep students longer. Some schools say, funding is really important to us, obviously, and we can't afford to take that funding hit. So we've got a lot of families upset, schools upset, staff upset, because, well, we wanted to send our student to Project Search or another transition program. So that's really hurt us in the last few years. Well, probably at least the last 5 or 6 years. Vocational rehabilitation, so it's not really a law, but it is a federal agency and it's in every state in the US. And I know the UK doesn't have anything quite similar. maybe a lot of your funds are distributed through local authorities, but in the US, the vocational rehabilitation services in every state help fund Project Search, but it's still different state to state. So Ohio, actually, where I'm from, gives more to Project Search than Nebraska, let's say. And it's just the way they choose to fund youth programs and the funds they have to start with and everything. So most states have benchmark payments, kind of what Hugh said earlier about results. So at every benchmark, so for each internship, they pay so much for Project Search, but toward the very end, for a job, then they pay another amount. Like I said, some states are more general, so Nebraska kind of gives a lump sum, but in most states, they help to fund the skills trainers or the job coaches and the job development portion, not the educational portion. Schools are actually funding the instructor position in Project Search, whereas VR is helping to fund the skills trainer job coaches. I hope that's clear. Because on site at Project Search, there are typically 2 to 3 staff, sometimes more, an instructor paid by the school, and 1 or 2 skills trainers or job coaches helped to fund by VR. Right now, VR is saying they'll fund more than 1 job. So if somebody wants, grocery stores are hiring, right? Retail stores are hiring right now because of COVID. And so those are the jobs that are available. So right now, Voc Rehab will pay a provider or the job developer to find a job now. And then if that student loses that job later and wants a job in their real preference area, they will fund another job. But typically, they just fund 1 job development benchmark. And then, of course, with VR, if somebody's case can be reopened if they lose their job or they need additional support, or maybe that they're just getting a promotion and they need some job coaching again, Voc Rehab will typically, not always, but typically reopen that case. So that's really important to us from a funding point of view. Department of Labor is important to us because our internships are non-paid. So our philosophy is that students are still learning, they're still in school. None of us got paid to go to high school. So students are in that learning mode and they're not getting paid for their internships, but it gives them certificates and other things that they can put on their resume, as well as this year of experience. So the US Department of Labor has guidelines for unpaid internships, and we comply with all of those guidelines, which make it possible for schools and businesses and Voc Rehab and all of our partners to collaborate and create each local Project Search program. And the guidelines are things like we follow an academic calendar, and that students are constantly learning new skills, and we're not replacing or supplanting anyone's job. And especially the businesses love this one, that the business is not required or responsible to hire the intern at the conclusion of the program. They can, and our statistics show that about 30% of our interns are hired at the host site at the end of the program, but it doesn't require them. And so it makes it much easier for a host business to say yes to Project Search. Yes, we will host you. I think if businesses said, yes, we'll host Project Search and we'll commit to hiring 10 interns every year, they probably wouldn't be able to say yes from an HR point of view. So I threw in something about the UK. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but the UK, and we don't typically use this term in the US at all, but NEET means not in education, employment, or training. So it refers to a person who is unemployed, not in school, not in any kind of rehab or vocational training program. So in the UK, we have about 85 programs in the UK, and there's a lot of program support. If you say you're targeting NEETs, which I think is just a really funny term, but anyway, so if you're targeting NEETs, I know Hugh's smiling, it is a funny term. So if you say, hey, Project Search in the Project Search in the UK is going to target NEETs, a lot of local authorities really like that because they need to target this area or this population of young people. And we can say we're addressing this population because we are. And that helps a lot of local authorities say, oh, good, they target needs, we'll help them with funding. So the next couple slides really aren't about laws, they're more about the philosophy of Project Search. So when we think about internships, a lot of our programs and a lot of our host businesses say, oh, you're gonna be like volunteers and you're gonna give us free labor. And we say, no, 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 we're not doing volunteer work and we're not free labor. If you think about volunteering, just think for a minute if you've ever volunteered anywhere. Maybe church, maybe you were a coach on a soccer team or a football team, maybe you volunteer maybe at a local food bank. No one ever expected you to get paid, and you never expected to get paid. You just did it because it's a passion. You really like young people, you believe in justice. For whatever reason, you gave some time from your busy schedule to volunteer. If you say, so I'll pick on Brent because I'm looking at Brent in the screen. If Brent says, hey, I've got this really cool internship at the university and I am so excited about it, our first thought is, wow, Brent's learning new skills. He must want to get a new job. He's going to increase his skill level and maybe he's going to get a new certification so that he can increase his work ability. So that's why language matters. We know that just from all the unrest that's going on in our country right now. Language matters. Words have an impact. And so it's really important in Project Search that we use the right word. If a new site says to us, well, we'll slide you in under the volunteer group, we say, no, no, no. We'd like you to slide us in under the education group, the training group, the intern group. So for example, we have a program at a big bank in the US called Fifth Third Bank, and they have a college intern program. And they're like, oh, this is great. You're just like our college intern program. We're like, yes, thank you very much. We're going to be like that. That makes more sense. And that way we are constantly thinking about work, but other people that hear the fact we have interns, they think of that as work also. So words in Project Search are very, very important. High expectations is one of my last slides. So we also have to have high expectations. It's interesting, I was just on a Zoom call earlier this week with a site from Florida who had, at first glance, very good outcomes. 7 out of their 8 interns all got jobs. And I called them to say, this is fabulous, tell me about their jobs. Well, the deeper we talked, it was obvious that none of them would qualify to be an outcome in Project Search. Like somebody got a job for 5 hours, somebody got a job for 10 hours. And I said, Janet, what's going on? Why didn't any of those kids get jobs for 16 hours? You understand that this is our benchmark. And she said, I can't get people out of the notion. I can't get people to think higher level for these students. They keep thinking of them as cute little kids with disabilities, and this job will be more like a hobby. And so we have to keep pounding that idea over and over. Work is 16 plus hours. Work is competitive environment. Work is integrated settings. So expectations matter. Also, every staff person, every partner needs to be all in. They have to know that. They have to say it. They have to get it across to families and not even staff. Sometimes our staff is the hindering. You know, they'll even say, well, that sounds like a really hard internship. I don't really think Brent could do that. So we have to keep that like at the very top. That's why the outcome of employment is our very first model component. If you don't remember anything else that we're about employment at 16 hours plus. So we have things like employment planning meetings. And I remember I was at another site once and they called them staffings. I said, no, do not say staffings. That sound like medical things. It's an employment planning meeting. We are planning for every intern to gain employment. So keep calling them that so that the team remembers that's why we're sitting around this table, and we do that 6 times a year. And I remember a teacher once said to me, you know, I have 10 interns, right? You know, if you're going to make me have 6 meetings, that's 60 meetings. I said, yep, I get it. That's a lot of meetings. Yep. But you have to be able to plan at strategic points during the year with that intern about employment. You can't wait till the end of the year. You have to do it in October, you have to do it in November, you have to do it in January, you have to do it in March, et cetera, et cetera. And the interns lead their own meetings. So it's very self-centered in a very good way. That's self-advocacy. I want this job. How can my team help me get that job? We also have steering committees. So while the employment planning meetings are very insular around a certain intern, steering committee is about the whole program. And they're about bigger picture things like marketing. How can we get to more schools? How can we recruit more young people? How can we have robust internships that have more skills? How can we increase our employment outcomes, et cetera, et cetera? So you've got little insular groups that are really important around the intern themselves. And then you've got this big steering committee that's about outcomes and the bigger picture kind of things. And both are equally important. And that's it. I'm sorry if I talked fast. I get passionate. I'm happy to take questions, or you can end it because you've probably been on the phone forever.
Are there any questions? So we will turn this over to, go ahead. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I've got one. One of the big issues in the UK around internships is that when somebody gets a job, they leave the college program, and I know Project Search might be different on this, but for most colleges, once somebody has left college, they're in a job through an internship. There seems to be very little thought about the ongoing support that employers might need in the future. So it becomes really unclear if the employer or the employee has a problem, who do they go to for help?
It's such a struggle, Hugh, because if they get a job at the host site, they really should be going to their manager if they have a problem. But if it's at the host site, sometimes they tend to go back to their instructor who's still there, you know, might be working with other interns. So we have to make a clear distinction that once they've got that job, they're an employee, they're not an intern anymore, and they should be working with their manager and mentor. I'm not sure if that's what you meant,
Yeah.
but they should have a job coach, you know, during that training time that could be pulled back if they need help with new skills, or if they need help in a promotion or a career advancement, or if technology impacts their job and maybe they need new accommodations. So there should be a way to connect with that provider, if you guys call them providers, that support employment organization, again, to say, hey, this young person needs more support right now. How can we loop back?
Okay. I guess the issue for me is we're getting to know how many people get jobs out of an internship in the UK. I don't think we've got any idea how many of those young people are still in work 4 months later.
Okay, that's a great, we are keeping data, so we know, the instructor, so the tutor inputs data in our database when they get a job. Well, they keep data throughout the program on their internships. They put in the data when they get a job, how many hours, and then 9 months after the program is over, they go in and update that data. So Hugh got a job 2 months after I put that data in. 9 months after the program is over, I go in and update it. Hugh still has that job. He got a 25-cent or 25 whatever raise. I update that. And then a year later, we are encouraging, we can't dictate it, but we are encouraging sites then to go back every year and find as many, and that by this time it might not be the tutor, it might be the job coach, would have better information on the interns. And so then they would go back and update that. And then that would hopefully force a conversation to say, oh my gosh, Hugh lost that job, or Hugh, I'm so glad you called because Hugh's really having difficulty, or I'm so glad you called because Hugh, I'm ready to teach him new skills and I don't know how. So hopefully, so some of that happens, and then the manager would have formed a relationship with that job coach when they were first there. Hopefully that all connects, and so might call that job developer or whoever to say, hey, I need you to come back for whatever reason.
I suppose.
And all the time, probably not.
I suppose where I'm going with this is that I think we all need to be working together better to help people develop careers rather than just get their first job.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's very difficult to resource and to fund at the moment, certainly in the UK.
It's hard in the US too, because like I said, sometimes Voc Rehab will only fund one job, and it might be your first basic job, but then I want to make a leap to something else. You and I had the advantage of, well, then I just go back to school and I get my master's, or I just go get a certificate. But we are also trying to work more with HR departments and do more what we call boundary spanning. So if an intern's in a job in a certain segment, what's kind of around that segment that he needs to get a certificate in to help him advance, whether it's a food service certificate or maybe, I don't know, maybe a hospital certificate around patient care. So we're trying to think of what other certificates we could build in to the program so that students have a little leg up to start moving up the chain.
Okay. Thank you.
Even if it's things like CPR and first aid, and like what we would call in the US a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, if they're in a hospital program.
Okay, thanks.
It's never perfect.
No.
Brent, thanks for this opportunity. It was fabulous.
Well, thank you. Karl, you're up.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much, Susie, and to all of you. And I think what I have learned from the session so far is that we actually are in a situation where we have to look at quality, at some sort of professionalism, and that data is very important for us to see if we are moving the right way. And I think also that it is data that has brought Brent and myself, at least, to come across this discussion about what is happening when it comes to supported employment for people with intellectual disability. And I'm not sure if everyone is in the position where they actually have the possibility to work as hard and as qualitatively well as you are doing, but it's very important to have some models and some results to share with each other. And thinking of the first webinar where we had Jarle Eknes from Norway presenting a project where they have started out trying to help people to get a job, and they also need to have some kind of a quality framework to work based on. And I think sharing with each other the important information that all of you have and that we can share with each other is also a way to make sure that we end up helping people to get a job and to be included in the workforce. And I think also that the internship, as you have presented, is something that at least students from high school in Norway need to have the possibility of experience. And if it's put in a better system, then perhaps we would also see a better outcome from it. So I think much of what has been talked about is very useful for all of us. So again, I would like to say thank you to all of you. And since we have had questions along, I'm not sure if we should actually open for any more questions, we are actually in a situation where we should start to end the whole session. And I would like to also then take the opportunity to tell you that we are planning the third webinar early fall this year. We haven't decided a date yet. It would be like in September, maybe October. We have the email address for all of you, and we'll send out more information and also put it on the website for the webinars, so that people can spread it and also attend it. And the next webinar will be on what we have called implementation. And you may wonder what that would be. And it would be about how you have tried to or succeed in implementing supported employment for persons with intellectual disability. And also then the phrase of inclusive supported employment, so that it's no doubt that it's in a regular workplace. And we will be open for people who have some examples or experiences that they like to share with each other. So if people who are attending this webinar think I should do this myself, or I know someone that I would like to ask to do it, or if you know someone that you think we should ask, then please send us an email and we will be in touch with you. And we hope to have more presenting at the webinar. We haven't decided a number, but we will perhaps limit the time a little more, so that we can allow to have up to 5 or maybe even 6 different presenters to talk about how they implement it in their country or in their local community. So that's more or less what I wanted to say. And thank you very much for attending. And I give it back to you again, Brent.
Again, just again, thank you so much, Rick and Hugh, and for being part of this presentation, and Karl actually also for sponsoring this and being part of this process. We wish you all well. We wish you safety. Please be careful, and I hope all of you have a good rest of the week. Take care, everyone.